Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Keynote Mobile Testing webcast, Mobile App Testing Best Practices, Building a Complete Multi-Stage Test Strategy with Keynote Mobile Testing. Your hosts today are Rachel Obsler, who is the VP of Product with Keynote, and Chris Karnacki, who is the Director of Solutions. And so a couple housekeeping items. We have a Q&A box. You can ask your questions in that box, and we will get to them at the end. So that's that. So we hope you enjoy this webcast, and let's get started, shall we? So what's the background? Why are we here? So the reason why we're here is because of this great opportunity, but that also brings great challenges. Currently, in 2015, there were over 227 billion apps downloaded. So the market is huge for apps, as you guys know. But the challenge is that users are becoming more and more fickle and demanding of their applications that are for quality and performance. The current stats say that around 16% of people are ever willing to give an app that has poor quality another chance. So really, you have just one chance, and this really raises the stakes as far as app quality and performance and what you need to give to your customers. The other side of it is an increasing amount of complexity. A good stat on this is that a recent study found that in 2015 there were over 24,000 distinct Android devices in the market. So the challenges for creating a customer experience that is both high quality and that delights and amazes customers is very high. And so that's why we're here today to talk about mobile testing in an agile environment and the best practices around that. And so with that, I will give it over to Rachel Obsler.
Thanks, Michael. So we've talked a bit, and Michael's talked a bit about the big change going on in the market around mobile and the movement to mobile access to different applications. There's also what comes with that, which is more software diversity, more hardware diversity. It means many more platforms to test on. There's also another huge change that's going on in the dev and test environment, and that is the move to more agile processes. And many organizations have already moved to Agile. Some are in the process of moving to Agile. Some are working in a hybrid Agile environment where they're using some waterfall techniques as well as some Agile techniques. But most organizations have or are in the process of making that transition. And so what does that mean to the test process? Well, I've heard some people say in the past that Agile actually means an end to QA. No more testers. Less testing happening. Now, there are some very public and use cases of testing, say, in production. So we've all heard Facebook talk about this. We've heard LinkedIn talk about this. But this isn't a method that most organizations can actually use to test their products. You can't really test in production if what you're offering is a way to transfer money from one account to another, or if you are actually offering a way to purchase things online. It's not okay for most users to get the feedback that, oops, we made a mistake there, sorry, you meant to buy something, and it just didn't work. So testing, if anything else, becomes more important in an Agile process. So it doesn't reduce the need for testing or remove the need for testers. It's really, in a way, the other way around. But what it does mean is that mobile and Agile necessitate a change to the way you do your testing. So it changes the nature of testing. And so what do I mean by that? Well, so one is it's really important to be able to automate because you're putting out release cycles faster, because you have more software and hardware diversity that you're dealing with. If you can't find a way to speed the testing process, then you're not going to be able to keep up with the demands of the releases that you need to keep up with. Continuous integration is really important. So one of the big important things of Agile is you're doing many more frequent builds, and you can't ever break the build. You have to keep the build process in a very steady pace. And so if you don't have a way to automatically, when you have a new build, test it to make sure that it's a valid build, then you're going to very quickly get behind. Another important piece is access to real devices. Because this is mobile apps, mobile products, it's really important to be able to test on the platforms that your customers are using. And then lastly, collaboration is more important with Agile as well. So these things are really important, and we're going to talk about all of them in a lot more detail as we go. Now, all of them, and we're going to talk about how Keynote mobile testing actually meets those needs. So what this Keynote mobile testing does in general is it provides interactive access to real devices. So you can do manual testing, you can do automation, so you can speed the release cycle. It provides a lot of scripting options so that it doesn't matter what the skill set of your team is, you'll be able to create scripts. It will integrate with your CI process, so it'll automatically kick off, when you kick off builds, it'll automatically kick off a series of tests. And it really supports all stages of the Agile test process. So what we're going to do for the remainder of the webinar is talk about some of the major stages and testing processes within Agile that you need to go through to put a release out. And for each one of them, we'll talk about what's important and give you a demo of our tool working and carrying out some real-life use cases. So what we're going to cover is unit testing, we'll cover build acceptance testing, regression testing, and then exploratory or negative testing. And, you know, of course, these are not all of the possible testing phases and types of testing that you can do within your release process, but these are probably the biggest and most major ones. So that's what we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to start with unit testing. So what's important about unit testing? Well, one thing to understand about unit testing is it's typically the developer that carries out the unit testing. And with Agile, it's also important to, or typically what the developer wants to do is write an automated test that they can run, and then when they have their developed unit done, their task done, then they can run that test, and then they can pass the whole thing on to QA. So they're passing on a tested element that they've developed to the QA team. Now, that's really important that the developer does that testing, and the reason is because every time you have a handoff in the Agile process, that's an opportunity for wasting time. Agile is really about moving as much as you can to the left of the process, as early in the process as you can, and making sure that teams really stay in sync so that you don't have handoff problems and you don't waste time. The worst thing that can happen is a developer develops something, they give it to QA, and QA has to immediately hand it back to them saying, well, it doesn't do what you said it did do, right? So QA really should be spending time on making sure that the new feature doesn't have any unintended effects on other things in the system, or putting together features that are developed by different people, doing integration testing. They shouldn't really have to spend time testing that what the developer said they did, they actually did. So that's one piece, is being able to give access to developers to be able to do their own testing. And the second piece that's key in unit testing is to consider actually testing on real devices. So developers will typically test on emulators. But if they have access to real devices, it's preferable to actually, as early on in the process, be able to test on real devices. And again, the reason is because emulators are different than real devices, and so I've listed some of the reasons for that here, but also because the later on you find an issue, the more costly it is to fix. So if a developer can test on a real device early on and find an issue that maybe would not have been found until they passed it over to QA, then once again, you're reducing the number of handoffs, you're reducing the amount of rework, and you're reducing cost in the process. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who is going to give us a demo of unit testing.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Everyone should be able to see my screen here. We're going to take a look at how developers can use Keynote's mobile testing platform to do unit testing. Now, we're just going to look at one way here. We're going to look at actually allowing developers to use their Appium unit tests against real devices that are out in this Keynote cloud. So just as a start here, I'm going to log into the Keynote cloud. We've got a web interface here. You're going to see, I'd just like you to see the actual test in action. And I'm going to take control of a device, In this case, it's going to be a Galaxy S5. This Appium testing can be done against iOS or Android devices that, again, are in that Keynote cloud. Now, I have my device acquired, or I have my control of it here, but where we're really going to work as a developer is in my IDE. Now, I've chosen to use Eclipse, and I've written my Appium test in Java, but you can, of course, leverage languages that Appium supports natively. So those of you that are familiar with Appium, it is a test tool that allows you to create a single repository of test code that can be run across both Android and iOS for your mobile applications or even your mobile websites. So this test here should look pretty familiar. I actually created this test using my Android emulator on my machine here. Now I want to extend and run this test against a Keynote device instead of running this unit test against just my locally emulated devices. And as Rachel mentioned, there's a lot of reasons for doing that. The real devices are going to behave and look and feel different than your emulated or simulated devices. So Keynote provides a REST API to actually make the connection between your computer, in this case your IDE with your test. This is a JUnit test I'm going to run. And it will actually make all the connections and handle the actual Appium piece as well. So if you're familiar with Appium, you have to have a target that you point your test at. This will do all that for you using that REST API. And those APIs are called up here at the top. So I'm going to run this, and I'm actually going to let you watch in real time as it runs this test. So this is just a single unit test, a JUnit test. You could, of course, link these together and use them with a runner class that actually allows you to run multiple unit tests together if you choose to. But what we're going to see in just a moment is that the actual test is going to run on this device. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I've taken control of this phone in my browser so that you can see what's actually going on. But that's not a requirement of using the Keynote devices for your unit testing with Appium. All of this can be done headless. You can trigger your Appium tests through your IDE however you wish. Just for the demo here, I'm showing you what that screen looks like. All the native Appium capabilities are at your disposal. So interacting with the application or website, editing text or information fields as you saw it do there just a moment ago, full Appium control, including any third-party libraries that Appium supports as well for image or text validation, again, are at your disposal. Keynote becomes your target for your test here, so you can test on these real devices without having to go out and buy phones for all of your developers and take on that burden of managing those assets. So we can see here that the test is completed. We get some console output here. I could, of course, add a lot more information if I'd like to see more details about what was seen on the device, both logs and or actual visual text coming back from that phone. But now that I've run this unit test on this new function I've created, I can now pass this off and say, okay, now this is a good function or good feature, this unit that I've tested, and I can pass it off to the next stage of my process. And Rachel's going to talk about the next stage of our Agile development process.
Thanks, Chris. So the next stage that we're going to talk about is build acceptance testing. So what's important about build acceptance testing? So the basic tenet of build acceptance testing in Agile is really that you're not supposed to break the build. And break the build can mean it doesn't build at all, but it can also mean that you can actually successfully create a build, you can maybe even put it on a device, but most of the functionality is broken. So that's a state that you don't want to be in. So build acceptance testing is typically a series of tests, not that many, maybe 10 to 30, that run through the major functionality of the application just to make sure that most of it is still there and working so that more testing can be completed. So, in Agile, you're potentially doing builds daily, could even be more often than that. And you need to know very quickly whether or not the build is good. So it's not like waterfall where you'd be working for months potentially on a new release and then spending weeks trying to get something to build and then having multiple days where there's testing going on until you finally get feedback of where you are. The whole point of Agile is that it can't take days, hours even, to find out if your build is good. You really need to know within minutes if your build is good. So what's really important here is both automation, so being able to automate your build acceptance tests, and also continuous integration. So the idea that you're working this into a continuous integration process where automatically, when you kick off a build, it's going to run a series of tests. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris, and he's going to show us an example of build acceptance testing and as part of a continuous integration process.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So I've picked my favorite CI system here, Jenkins, but you could do this with other continuous integration tools that are out there. What we're going to look at is enabling now your development or your build management or release management team to extend their existing process, which generally includes having maybe nightly or weekly builds created by your Jenkins machine, and leaves them with an actually compiled or built application, so an Android APK or an iOS IPA file. That's great, but where that leaves you is now having to manage that file, bring it out to either emulated or real physical devices sitting on your desk, in your hands, or in the cloud, and then start some testing, whether it is automated or manually testing that new build of the application. With Keynote's mobile testing plugin for Jenkins, we allow you to extend your existing build process. And what it's going to allow me to do after we get through configuration of the plugin is configure our project. And here you'll see that I've got some new options here. So on my build, I can add additional post-build steps. And what I've done here is I've told it to upload this application build. You can see my APK file. Again, we can do IPA for iOS as well. I'm telling it to upload this application to a device. We can choose device or devices here. And this will now take the application from your Jenkins machine, and it will push it to the Keynote cloud and install it to your devices. That application will still only be available to your account, so you don't have to worry about other Keynote customers seeing your pre-release builds of your applications. It will be available only to you. Now, once the application is installed on the device, that's step one. But we now want to do some testing, and we want to automate that test. And it's going to be a small set of what may end up becoming your regression tests. We want to do some basic sanity or smoke tests that say, okay, yes, the application installs properly to these devices. The basic functionality works. It will launch. Maybe we can log in. Maybe we can perform some sort of transaction and we can log out. It's not going to go through a full suite of function tests or feature tests. So I've defined some tests here, and these are tests that were created inside of the Keynote interface, which we'll look at a little bit later. And I've told it what tests I want to run and on which devices. And for the demo here, I'm going to run on a singular device, but we can run on multiple devices in parallel, should we choose to. And we make those changes, make those decisions, and we'll say save. And I'm going to build this project now. Traditionally, this would be triggered on whatever cadence your build process runs, whether it's nightly, weekly, or multiple times per day, maybe on any check-in. We can watch the console output here. You can see it's making our connection to the Keynote cloud. It uploaded the application to the Keynote cloud, again, to your own account, not for anyone else's viewing. And then we're going and actually running our tests here. And these are automated functional tests that are running against that device, that target device you selected, or devices, should you have chosen more than one. Now, when this test is done, it will report back to Jenkins, and we'll step back at a previous build. we can see that we had a successful build. And that includes all of your previous steps, which would be compiling and building your application, and now, of course, the installation of the application to the Keynote real devices and any subsequent automated tests you ran. And it's going to show us the status of each of those steps. So we uploaded the application. Our test of the special offer functionality of the application was successful, and our managed travel test was successful as well. We can link directly to the results of this test as well. And these results are going to show you each individual step that we walked through. So our application launched successfully. We were able to continue as a guest rather than logging in. We navigated to the special offers page of the application, and we closed the application. Now, there's some more detailed reports we get here as well that aren't necessarily things that a release manager would look for. So we'll actually dig into these results in a separate demo in just a few more minutes. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Rachel.
Thanks again, Chris. Okay, so now we're going to talk about regression testing. So what's different about regression testing versus build acceptance testing? Well, first of all, they're not run quite as often. You basically are going through regressions when you want to do a release as opposed to necessarily every build. The second is that there's a lot more tests. And so what that typically means, because with regression you're really trying to go through as much of the functionality you can in the application to make sure nothing changed with all the additional features and functions that you added. It means that there's more of a management component to regression testing. There's many, many tests. You may need to be able to run them in different order. You may need to have different areas of functionality of the application grouped together so that you can choose, oh, I just want to exercise this area because this is where we're touching the code versus that area. You may have lots of different people working on these scripts because it's a large body of work. So one piece here is the management of the regression test. And then the other thing with regression tests that's important to understand is, again, it's a large body of work. You have a set of people typically on your team, maybe you're outsourcing, but often on your team that's going to be writing and maintaining scripts. So you have to understand and cater to sometimes the skill sets of those people. So they could be very comfortable programming in Java, writing tests that are Appium scripts, or they may be comfortable using another, say, desktop tool. So maybe they have a long history using HP UFT, for instance. So it's great to understand what are the skill sets of your team and make sure that the tool that you have can, support the skill sets that your team has as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Chris again, and he's going to show us an example of a regression test running.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm actually going to log into our interface where we can create some automated tests and drive these automated tests. And it's going to look very similar to what we looked at during the first demonstration. What we're going to be looking at is real mobile devices. They're not emulators or simulators. It's not a local device plugged into my laptop here. It is actually going to be access to a real phone or tablet. And what I've done is created an automated test suite. And this test suite is going to run a series of what we call test cases. They're user journeys or user transactions that I want to make sure always work in my application on multiple devices. Again, maybe iOS, Android, different versions of those operating systems. And what this means is that I can automate the testing of my new build of my application. Maybe it's my release candidate before I push it to the public markets for these applications, the Apple App Store, the Google Play Store. And I can check to make sure that I haven't caused any regressions. None of the previously working functionality has stopped working due to new features or functions I may have added, code changes that I've made, or even back-end service changes that I've made. We can make sure that everything is still functional on that application from the user's perspective. Now, Rachel mentioned that we have a way for people with a variety of skill sets to create these tests. What we're looking at here is Keynote's native interface to create these tests. That allows a user to use a built-in recorder, much like someone who's familiar with UFT may be used to doing. You can actually click on the real device on the side of my screen here. I'll show you on this Android. We can actually click on the real device, and we can have it write my test. So as I click on, maybe my application is this message plus. As I click on this, I can actually have it record my interaction. Or as I browse the web, I can have it record that interaction and build checkpoints and interaction points for me. Keynote also provides an API that allows you to programmatically create these tests in your favorite IDE, so Eclipse or IntelliJ. We also have plugins for HP's product set for UFT. You can use your UFT knowledge to create these tests and run them as a regression suite. We can also manage Keynote-created tests or UFT-created tests from ALM or Quality Center. So we have a variety of ways that we can actually create and drive these tests. Now, for the demonstration here, I'm going to drive them directly from Keynote's interface. I'm actually going to click Run here, and we can watch it now run my test on this real device. Traditionally, this would be done headless, so I would create this and run it at some schedule. Keynote has a built-in scheduling utility that will actually allow me to define my schedule. We can see here. I have it set currently to run Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and on the weekend, so 7 days a week at 10 p.m. So now I can come in the morning and see my test results for that specific run. Now, true regression set, you're probably not running every night. Maybe you're going to run it once a month because that's the frequency at which you've got a release candidate for the public consumption. But we leave it to you to define what is going to work for your organization and your existing process. But you can see it navigating through the device here. And these tests are, again, created in one of many different ways, but they're actually navigating and interacting with the device just as a user. They are looking at the device screen, so we can do image and text recognition, or ultimately what's called object recognition. So we can create a single test that will run across any iOS or any Android device. In fact, this specific test was created using an iOS device, an iPhone 6 in particular, and I'm running it here against this Android device. So this allows me now to leverage what I've created against one device or one platform and run it across many different devices. Now, while this is running, we'll walk through some of this, the test management capabilities that are built into the tool here. And what we're looking at is what we call a test cycle. You may refer to it as a test suite or a regression suite. But what it is it's a collection of test cases. So we see my test cases here. You can think of these as your user journeys. What are common things your users do within your application? In this case, they check in for their flight. They check their flight status and so on. Our actions are what actually build our test cases. So think of an action as a unit test. I want to test as a certain piece, smaller piece of that overall user journey or user transaction, does it work? So this tests to make sure that the check-in piece works. Maybe that the button works and it gets me the next page. This checks that the continuous guest piece works and gets me to the next page. So think of these as individual unit tests, or if you're a programmer, think of them as a function. These are very reusable. So I can create this set of assets called actions, and they become my building blocks that will be used to create my actual test cases. So let's take a look at this test case. This is the first one that was run inside of my test cycle or my regression suite. If we look at this here, it's just built up of these different actions. And this is really powerful because this allows us to insert additional unit tests or functional tests in existing tests that I've already created. It also allows us to reuse and leverage work that was previously done. So if one member of your QA team builds some test assets for a certain user journey, and 90% of the next user journey you want to test is the same. Maybe there's some new functionality you add. You can leverage what you've already created and simply insert additional steps or additional actions, as we call them here. So it allows you to reuse that. It also allows your users to share their work. So not only manage here, but also share their work, so that if you have an offshore team, maybe you have partners or other vendors that are working on application development for you, or even testing, you can make sure that everybody's on the same page and they're all utilizing the same set of test assets, and in fact the same set of test devices. So there's no ambiguity as to whether or not the issue came from the testing methodology, the actual test steps, or even the test devices. This allows you to make sure that everyone is using that consistent set of real devices for their testing. Now, let's take a look at the results. What's the output from these tests here? I'm going to jump in to my browser, and we're going to look at some tests that were previously run. When the currently running test finishes, the test results will be uploaded to this portal here. So this is going to be what we call your results portal. And we have a few different views. We can look at results by project. So if you have different teams working on different applications or services, they can be managed as separate projects, should you choose to do that, so that each team has access to only what they need access to. And we're going to look at my test cycle, so my regression suite that I ran this morning on this device here. Click on that detailed link. We can see that this test ran against the Galaxy S5. Here are my 4 test cases that ran. They were all successful. So if you ran this across multiple devices in parallel, or even in sequence, you have a much larger grid here that you can take a look at, see the status of each individual test case. You can also export this data out. So if you need to provide a report to management, to your QA leads, to your CDOs, your CMOs, of what that test status looks like, you can export this here and present that to them. Now let's click on the success link. So we see check-in was successful. Well, how do we know it was successful? What actually happened here? At a high level, we provide some basic information about who executed the test, the time and date that it ran. We can see that each individual unit worked, so the application launched properly. We were able to continue as guest. We checked in and we closed the application. But now let's dig in a little bit further. This step here lets us know that from the time that a user touched continue as guest until the time that they were able to use the application at this next screen took 2.375 seconds. So we provide some performance information here as well. We take a screenshot when we start looking to validate something. In this case, again, we're validating that the device ended up on this screen. So our second screenshot is when we validate. What did the user see when they got to the point we were expecting them to get to, so that our application was working as expected? Here's what we expect to see. This is how we actually validated. So in this case, we're looking at objects, and we're looking for the object that has a tag of login or enroll. Now it's important to note here that having visibility into these objects does not require any modification to your application or your code. This is all using the built-in tools and frameworks from the platforms themselves, from Google and from Apple. So you don't need to repackage your application. You don't need to insert any SDKs or any additional libraries. It does not require Keynote to jailbreak iOS devices or root Android devices. This is all right out of the box. You're testing the same version of your application that you ultimately will be promoting to the application stores. So we expected to see this login or enroll object, and here you can see all of the objects that we saw. In fact, here is login or enroll. Now this test, all these steps were successful. Had there been an issue, you would see a red X next to the step that failed. And depending on how you built your test, the test may move on, or it may have a wholesale failure and stop execution. You can customize how you want to handle these exceptions. These results here can then be archived for viewing later. We can email them out to members of our team, to partners, to vendors, to business leaders should they need to see them. We can export these results to a PDF, and we'll include all of these screenshots, again, for sharing. Or we can flag these results for further review if we choose to. This test, again, was run on an Android device. We can see the same results or same sorts of results for an iOS device as well. We come into a previous result. We're going to see the same thing and see those same objects. So here for the same step, see it's still that same. We're waiting for something. You'll see here we were looking for the object login or enroll, and here are all of the objects we saw. So the test is portable across platforms. So a single test on one created against one platform can be run against another platform. Now, again, I triggered this test using our run button here. This can be triggered, again, using Keynote's built-in scheduler. It can be triggered using a number of any other tools, including Jenkins that we looked at earlier, tools from HP, IBM, Microsoft, or even a simple command line utility that Keynote provides, as well as an API that Keynote provides. So it really allows you to do that do your regression testing from any existing process you're doing today, but to now extend it into real mobile devices without taking on the burden of managing them yourselves. All right, Rachel.
Thanks, Chris. So what we're going to do next is actually do a poll, because what would a webinar be without a poll? So what we're asking is, of your mobile development projects that you know of in your organization, what % of your regression testing is automated? So why don't we have everyone answer the poll? So it's either, basically a quarter of them, quarter to a half of them, over a half to 3/4, or 3/4 or more. And you can also answer you're not sure if you're not really sure. So while that's going on, one thing that I find interesting about development, and it's one of the things I know our engineering team struggles with, is automation is really important for speeding up the development process, and it's important for ensuring quality. Also because it offloads testers from doing things that they find tedious, right? So they can spend more time on more high-value testing than doing the same thing over and over. But one thing that's really tough about it is if your testers are always testing because they can't keep up with all the testing, when do they find the time to do the automation and put the automation in place? So I think that's one of the things that organizations struggle with most is when do they have the time to do the automation? Okay, so let's see how everyone answered. So it looks like we have the largest percentage of people with 0 to 25%, which is not really that surprising. That's typically, what we see when we talk to a lot of our customers as well, that, although you want to do automation and it makes sense to do automation to speed up the process, it is hard to find the time to do automation. So we have some percentage of people that are doing more than that, though. So 12% doing over 26%, and then 10% over 51%. So that's good.
All right. So now I think we're going to take a look at Oh, sorry, Rachel.
Yeah. So okay. So let's go back to the slides briefly. So one other thing we want to show quickly is also what we see with the industry. And so just some stats on the industry as well, is that what we see, and this isn't just for mobile, but it's for everyone, this is from Forrester, is that about across different types of testing, about 53% of people are automating, or they're automating 53% of unit tests, automating 45% of functional tests, 42% are actually doing continuous testing, so tests are kicked off at each code check-in and integration. So it's interesting that even though, it makes a lot of sense to do automation, it's still very early in the process. So I think with that, we'll go and talk next about exploratory and negative testing. So one thing that we just talked about automation, how important it is to automate, but the fact is, and we saw some of those percentages, that it's very difficult and really impossible to ever get to 100% automation. And so even with automated testing, for regression, you're not going to get to 100% of all tests. So so there's also other types of testing, like exploratory testing or negative testing, that really has to be done in a manual fashion. So, when you're thinking about exploratory or negative testing, and exploratory, what that means is really acting like a user. So putting yourself in the space of a user and really just kind of playing around with an app as you think a user would do. And then negative testing really means let's try to break it, right? So let's find ways like logging in 3 times in a row, or things that we can do that actually will stop the app from working. So when someone is doing exploratory or negative testing, it's really much more high-value manual testing than doing regression. So you want to get your testers doing as much of this as possible, because it also improves the quality of your application. So what's important with this type of testing? Well, one is testing on real devices. And we've mentioned this earlier, but it's even more key here that if you're acting like a user, you really should be testing on the platform that your users are using. So test on real devices, but when you're testing on real devices, you don't want to have to have a box of devices at your desk. Sometimes you have testers that are located offshore. It's sometimes difficult for them to get devices, or they can't test in network that they need to test in. So it's really great if you can give your testers access to devices in the cloud so they don't have to have boxes of devices at their desk all the time. So, and then they also don't have to do things like buy devices, manage plans, keep track of them, etc. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he's going to show some easy ways to do exploratory or negative testing, or really manual testing, with a cloud of devices.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to sign back in to the Keynote mobile testing cloud here. And we're going to look at a few ways we can do that exploratory, negative, or what some people call manual testing here. So what we provide access to is a large cloud of real devices. So again, you don't have to manage those in desk drawers, in filing cabinets, wherever they may be. And provide access to both phones and tablets on a variety of operating systems, both platforms, so Android, iOS, Windows, and BlackBerry, as well as a variety of operating system versions. Now we can look for a specific device. If we know that we need to do a test on an iPhone 6, let's say, I can type in iPhone 6, and we can see here the iPhone 6 devices that Keynote has available. Now there's not just 5 available here. You'll see that we actually have 2 iPhone 6s available with the same operating system. We've got 4 iPhone 6 Plus, 10 down here. So there are multiple copies of the more popular devices. We also have the ability to look for devices with a specific characteristic, and that characteristic might be by carrier. Because not only are they real devices that you have access to, they also are real devices with real voice, data, and text messaging plans. So it's about as close as you can get to reaching into your customers' pockets and using their cell phone or tablet as you can get. These are, again, real phones, just like your clients or end users would be using. So maybe we say we want to test on an Android device that is running 5.1. Here are all the Android devices running 5.1. And we can add additional lines to this here. We're going to reset this. I'd like to show you all of them. but it's very easy to take control of them. I'm going to look at one of my favorite devices here, and I'm going to take control. This is kind of what we saw earlier. It's a real device. It's 1:48 p.m. here in the West Coast, and you'll see that reflected here. Again, it does have a real voice, data, and text messaging plan. This is on the 4G network, also connected to a Wi-Fi access point. And if I'm a tester or even a developer and I have a new build of my application or a new build of my site that I want to run a quick test against and do some exploratory, some negative testing, some quick sanity testing to make sure the application, the new function I've added actually works on a real device, but I don't necessarily want to automate it yet. I'm not sure that it's going to stay in that application. I can install it to this device using a built-in application installation utility. You can also download it over the air from any staging environment you may have that's accessible from these devices, or your own enterprise application store if you're using an internal application environment as well. And once that application's installed, I navigate through the device, through the application, the same way that I would a phone in my hand. So in this case, I click with my mouse pointer on the device screen. I'm going to actually go to the downloaded apps. And maybe I want to go to that expense manager application that we ran an Appium unit test on before. This is exactly what your users would see if they had this application version on their device. What you're seeing is exactly what you would see if this physical, real device was in your hand. Now, if I'm navigating through here and I find a bug, I find a defect or some issue, of course, I want to be able to share that. Now, there's plenty of screen capture tools for your entire computer screen to take, but Keynote actually has the ability to export screenshots or videos from the device, and videos from the device meaning a recording of what I've been doing on this device. I can go back in time, pick and choose some screenshots, or pick and choose a video of my control of this phone and subsequent interaction with the application. So they can not only provide my developers with screenshots of what the error looked like, but also how I got there. So I can go back in time here and export those locally to my file system, or I can export them to the cloud. So I'll take, for example, this screenshot. If I want to export this to the cloud, it's going to go to that same results portal we looked at earlier with our automation results, and we can now see our screenshot here. And it looks like, unfortunately, I didn't give it enough time to load up there, but it will bring you back out to that portal. We can also export here to my local machine and download here. Now, we also can test some things on devices that you can't test with emulators. We can actually test the rotation of the device, and we're controlling that actually via hardware. So we're not sending an API signal to the device to make sure that the application actually rotates or behaves properly. I'm going to here do a quick search. Google will actually rotate for us in the browser. We'll see here that it does rotate. So we can make sure that it behaves properly if the user rotates that device as well. So you've got control of things on the device that we don't have control on with those emulators or simulators. The other thing we can do is do some interrupt testing with the battery of the device. So even though the device is remote to you, you can see what happens if a user is in the middle of doing something. Good example would be to doing a balance transfer from one bank account to another in your banking application. What happens if that's right in the middle of transferring and the power to the device dies? We can actually test that here and see what happens if the battery dies. Does the transaction complete? Do they get some sort of error or recovery message when they then power back on and launch that application? This is also helpful when you're testing that new build of your application and the application crashes. It's obviously something you want to catch. Is it going to crash on a real device? And if it does, even though this phone is remote to you, you actually have remote control over that device to gracefully bring it back online or bring it back under your control so you can continue your testing. Excuse me. We have the ability to get into device logs as well as manually get the device ready to do some Appium testing. Now, this is using our UI here, the Keynote interface into the device. We also recently announced a partnership with SAP that allows SAP shops that are using the SAP mobile cloud to access Keynote's device cloud directly from SAP. So I'm going to log in here, and imagine I'm a developer and I'm in charge of the applications that my teams are building to mobilize my SAP instance. I would come into my application section here. I can see what applications my developers have been building. I can see what versions they're on. And let's say I'm here and I want to test and make sure that this tracker application works on my devices. Developers, of course, will tell the system what platforms they work on. This is iOS. If we come back to another one, you'll see that we have an Android one here as well. So we see supported platforms, Android. And this is all set up by the developers, again, that are mobilizing your SAP instance. Now, the great thing here is we have the ability now to jump out and launch this application directly on the Keynote's real devices. We walk through here, we allow the application to be shared to the Keynote device, again, to your private account, so no one else can see this. And Keynote automatically only gives you access to the devices that your application will run on, in this case, Android. And let's say I want to now run this application on this, let's do a Moto X. I select that device. It's going to take control of the device, get the application from your SAP instance there, that mobile cloud instance. It's going to install the application on the device. It's then going to launch it on the device. So I can just start testing right away. I don't need to go through any additional steps to get that application up onto that phone or that tablet. And again, this works for both iOS and Android. This overlay just kind of lets us know what's going on. Looks like we should get control of the device in just a moment here, and I can begin that exploratory testing now of that new build. So I can start clicking on the device, and again, entering information into that phone as I see fit. We'll type on the phone here exactly what I tell it to. And we have all the same sharing and collaboration, reporting capabilities as we did directly through the Keynote interface, as we did in this SAP integration into the Keynote device cloud. So again, the Keynote device cloud is very useful for your exploratory negative testing. So you have access to those real devices, which are, as Rachel has mentioned multiple times, very important for your testing. All right, we'll turn it back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Chris. So we've talked about 4 stages of testing: the unit testing, build acceptance testing, regression testing, and exploratory or negative testing. And, you know, obviously, as we've shown, testing is varied. Different stages need different types of process to carry out the testing. Some of them are largely manual, some of them are largely automated, some are a mix of the two. But the common thread through all of them really is access to real devices. And to the extent that you can have your whole Agile team using a consistent set of devices that are managed by someone else, so you don't have to take care of those devices, and so you can focus on testing, is really key. So with that, just in summary, basically what Keynote mobile testing enables you to do is to, 1, enable real device testing much earlier in the process, so that lowers the cost of finding issues. It enables you to speed time to market because you can automate, you can integrate with your CI process, you can automatically kick off tests every time you have a build. It enables you also to flexibly meet the scripting needs of your team, because we have lots of different scripting options. We also have lots of different integrations with other tool sets that you may be familiar with. It helps you reduce the issue or headache of managing all these devices sitting around, and then also enables remote teams with access to real devices so that they can be a part of the whole mobile testing process. So with that, I think we're close to out of time, but I think we may have time for a few questions. So
yeah, so there's lots of good questions here. We've got time to answer just a couple. First, and I think probably one of the most important questions, Rachel, is a couple of people have actually asked, how do you know what devices to test against and how many? How should an organization approach that?
yeah, so it's not really a one-size-fits-all answer. So one thing is, first and foremost, to look at your target market, right? So if you already have a mobile app and you have any sort of stats through your mobile app of what devices are actually accessing that app, that's the first place to start. So you can really target your largest customer base or your target customer base. And then beyond that, it's good to get as much coverage as you can across the market. So it's pretty straightforward to get even stats on, what percent of people on Android are on 5 dot whatever versus 4 dot whatever. You can get stats like that from Google. They're typically published. So I would get a good cross-section of OS versions, certainly. And when you have that cross-section of OS versions, a good thing to do then is also to vary the form factor of the device. So let's say you're using, a Galaxy S6 for the latest, or S6 Plus, whatever, Edge, whatever it's on now for the latest Android version. Well, then use a different manufacturer and form factor for a different Android OS version. So it's a tough thing to answer to say, how many devices you need to test on, because it really depends on the cross-section of the actual users in your application. But, a good rule of thumb is that when you're doing build acceptance testing, you should run it at least on one Android and one iOS device. And when you're doing regression testing, you probably want to get up to at least 10, but maybe even up to as many as 25 to 30.
Sure. I think that Keynote can help you develop that plan of what devices you want to test against and what operating system versions through looking at not only kind of industry research and our experience in the field, but also looking at what we see our other customers and enterprises that may be like you. If you're a financial enterprise, we can look at what other financial enterprises are doing as far as numbers of devices, different permutations of form factors in OS, and something we can definitely lend some experience to in helping you develop that plan. Another good question was, does the tool work with mobile web solutions and native applications? I can take that one. So answer is yes. I know today we focused on just native apps, but the tool can absolutely be used for mobile web and native applications, and that also includes hybrid applications. All of the same strategies that we talked about today, from early unit testing all the way through regression testing and including that exploratory and negative testing, can be done on the Keynote cloud for any of those applications, native, hybrid, or pure mobile web.
So we're a little bit over, but maybe one more quick question.
Sure. All right. We'll pick one more here. A couple people asked about being able to use their existing tools from HP. I see HP's UFT mentioned as well as ALM. Can you talk a little bit about how they can do that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So you can absolutely use your existing tool set. So we have a very tight integration with HP UFT, previously called QTP. So we actually have a plugin so that you can actually stay and operate within the confines of UFT with a small plugin for our device, and you can literally see the device just the same as Chris was showing the device on screen through all of these demos. You can click on the device, you can actually record a QTP or UFT script by clicking on the device, or you can author that script in UFT directly, but also have the device there and be able to run things right on the device and see them running. The same thing goes for ALM. So I don't know if the question was also about ALM.
But I mentioned how they could utilize a test management tool like ALM, and the same answer will go for RQM as well.
Yep, so you can certainly both kick off tests and manage tests from ALM that are tests that run on the Keynote devices, and they can be, again, they can be UFT scripts or they can actually be Keynote scripts. So it could be either type. And then you can also then, it'll pull the results back into ALM. So you can view and manage everything from ALM if that's what you want to do as well.
So you can keep that single system of record for those results.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, great, everyone. That's all the time we have for today. A couple more housekeeping items. We will be emailing you all a copy of the on-demand video, a link to that in the presentation. Most importantly, though, if you'd like to get started, you can certainly contact us to get your own personalized demo of Keynote Mobile Testing Enterprise. The easiest way to do that now is to go to the website and go to the Get Started button on our homepage, and you can fill out a form, and we'll contact you immediately. In that email will also be detailed contact information should you want to get a hold of us. So with that, we thank you for attending, and take care and have a great day.